It's February 1943. The sky over the Kuban River is the color of iron. Aleksandr Pokryshkin sits in the cockpit of his P-39 Airacobra, 5,000 feet above the frozen earth. His breath clouds the canopy. The engine behind him, not in front, behind, thrums through the airframe like a second heartbeat. Below, German Bf-109s are strafing Soviet positions. They don't know he's here. Pokryshkin rolls, inverted. The world flips. Earth becomes sky. He pulls through, diving, the nose dropping like a guillotine blade. The 37mm cannon mounted in the spinner, the largest gun ever fitted to a single-engine fighter, begins to hum with potential energy. The Messerschmitts are fast, but they're low. And in this thin, cold air, close to the ground where the Airacobra was born to fight, they've made a fatal mistake. Pokryshkin closes to 300 meters. 200. The German pilot still hasn't seen him. 100 meters. He squeezes the trigger. The 37mm shell punches through the 109's fuselage. The aircraft shudders, trails smoke, and spirals down. Pokryshkin pulls up, banks hard, already scanning for the next target. The VVS, the Soviet Air Force, had been written off by nearly everyone. Their pilots were undertrained, their tactics costly, their equipment often obsolete, and the P-39, the Americans didn't even want it, called it unsuitable for high-altitude combat. The British tested it and sent it back. But here, on the Eastern Front, in the hands of men who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove, the P-39 Airacobra became something else entirely. It became a weapon. This is the story of the most misunderstood fighter plane of World War II. How a rejected American design, mocked by German aces and abandoned by the RAF, was transformed by Soviet pilots into one of the most effective low-altitude fighters of the war. This is the story of the Airacobra, and the men who made it legendary. To understand why the P-39 became what it became, you have to go back to 1937. America is not at war, but everyone knows war is coming. The US Army Air Corps issues a specification. They want a new fighter, something fast, something modern, something that can compete with the European designs that are starting to dominate the skies over Spain, where the dress rehearsal for World War II is already underway. Bell Aircraft Corporation, a small, scrappy outfit in Buffalo, New York, decides to submit a design. And it's weird. Most fighters of the era follow a simple formula: engine in the nose, cockpit behind it, guns in the wings. It's been that way since the First World War. It works. But Bell's chief designer, Robert Woods, looks at that formula and says, what if we broke it? What if we put the engine behind the pilot? What if we ran a long drive shaft from the engine through the cockpit to a propeller in the nose? What if we took all that space in the nose, the space where the engine used to be, and mounted a cannon there? Not a machine gun. A cannon. It's radical. It's elegant. It's unconventional. The military is intrigued. In 1939, the prototype flies. The XP-39, sleek, low-slung, with a tricycle landing gear that makes it look like something from the future. The cannon, a 37mm Oldsmobile T9, pokes out of the propeller spinner like the stinger of a wasp. It's fast, it's heavily armed, it looks like nothing else in the sky. Orders pour in. The British want it, the French want it, the Americans order hundreds. But there's a problem. Between the prototype and production, something happens. The Army decides the Airacobra doesn't need a turbo supercharger, the device that lets an engine maintain power at high altitude. The reasons are complex. Weight concerns, cost, production priorities, and questions about reliability. But the result is catastrophic for high-altitude performance. Without the turbo supercharger, the P-39's Allison V1710 engine performs well at low altitude, but above 15,000 feet, power drops off dramatically. And in 1940, when the Battle of Britain is being fought at 20,000 feet and higher, that's a serious problem. The British take delivery of their Airacobras in 1941. They conduct limited operations over France. The results are disappointing. The Bf-10-9s can climb above them and engage at altitudes where the Airacobra struggles. The P-39 can't compete where the European air war is being fought. The RAF withdraws them from frontline service, declares them unsuitable for the high-altitude combat environment they face. The Americans, now in the war after Pearl Harbor, try to use them in the Pacific and other theaters. Similar issues emerge. Against Japanese fighters in high-altitude engagements, the P-39 is at a disadvantage. Pilots criticize its high-altitude performance. The press writes unfavorable reviews. By late 1942, the United States Army Air Force is looking for ways to make use of the thousands of P-39s being produced. And then Lend-Lease offers a solution. Send them to the Soviets. Let's talk about what the Soviet Air Force looked like in 1942. Because if you want to understand why the P-39 succeeded in Soviet hands when it struggled elsewhere, you need to understand the catastrophe the VVS had just survived. June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German troops pour across the Soviet border. The largest invasion in human history. In the first day, the Luftwaffe destroys well over 1,000 Soviet aircraft, many of them on the ground, lined up at forward airfields, caught by surprise. By the end of the first week, Soviet aviation losses are staggering. Entire air regiments are destroyed before they can mount effective resistance. Pilots who manage to get airborne are often flying older designs, Polikarpov H-15S and I-16S, against Bf-1 09SL. The technological and tactical gap is severe. Stalin's purges in the late 1930s had decimated the officer corps. Experienced commanders were gone, shot, or imprisoned. The men replacing them were often inexperienced and operating under fear. Soviet tactics were costly. Pilots were sometimes ordered to ram German bombers if they exhausted their ammunition. It's called Tarn. Some pilots did it, not from suicidal tendencies, but from desperation and duty. By 1942, the Soviet Union is fighting for survival. They've lost millions of men, entire cities, vast territories, and their air force needs help. Enter Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease is the American program that sends war material to the Allies. Tanks, trucks, food, aircraft, thousands of aircraft. The British get Spitfires. The Americans keep the P-51s and P-47s for themselves. The Soviets receive various types, including the planes other air forces found less suitable for their needs. P-40 Warhawks, adequate but limited, Hurricanes, capable but aging, and P-39 Airacobras, lots of them. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States ships approximately 4,750 P-39s to the Soviet Union, nearly half of all Airacobras ever built. The planes arrive via multiple routes, including the Alaska-Siberia route, flown across the Bering Strait by Soviet ferry pilots, including women aviators. It's a demanding journey. Some pilots die in crashes, in storms, in the unforgiving wilderness. But the planes keep coming, and when they arrive, something unexpected happens. The Soviets embrace them, not immediately. Soviet pilots are initially skeptical. They've heard the reports, the American and British assessments calling the P-39 unsuitable for modern air combat. But then they fly it, and they realize this plane fits a different war. Here's what the Soviets understood that others had missed. The Eastern Front Air War wasn't primarily being fought at 20,000 feet. It was being fought at 5,000 feet and below. While the Western Allies are conducting high-altitude strategic bombing campaigns and fighting for air superiority in the stratosphere, the Eastern Front is a different kind of conflict. Ground attack, close air support, tank hunting, strafing, tactical bombing, reconnaissance. The war isn't primarily in the clouds. It's close to the ground, and down there, below 10,000 feet, the P-39 Airacobra is a different proposition entirely. Let's talk about what makes the P-39 distinctive. First, that engine placement. By putting the Allison V-1710 behind the pilot, Bell created a fighter with excellent weight distribution. The center of gravity is positioned well, right under the pilot's seat. What does that mean? It means the P-39 has good handling characteristics. At low altitude, with that balanced weight distribution, the Airacobra responds predictably to control inputs. It's stable, controllable, well-behaved. Soviet pilots, working with varied levels of training, find it relatively straightforward to fly. The controls are reasonably light. The visibility, thanks to car door-style side entries and a good canopy design, is excellent compared to many Soviet types. Second, that cannon. The 37mm M4 cannon mounted in the propeller hub fires a substantial projectile. One hit can severely damage or destroy an enemy fighter. It's devastating against bombers and ground targets. Soviet pilots appreciate its hitting power, though the slow rate of fire, approximately 1 round per second, requires discipline and accuracy. The P-39 also carries 2.50 caliber machine guns in the nose and 4.30 caliber guns in the wings, in most variants. The concentrated nose armament is particularly effective. Third, speed and performance at low altitude. At low altitude, the P-39 is competitive, over 350 miles per hour in level flight at its optimal altitude. The Germans are flying Bf-109s and Fw-190s that have advantages at height. But down low, in the dense air, the Airacobra performs well. And fourth, this is important, protection. The P-39 has armor plate behind the pilot's seat. The fuel tanks are self-sealing. The engine placement provides additional protection from frontal attacks. For Soviet pilots who've been flying fighters with less protection, this is significant. The P-39 can absorb battle damage and bring the pilot home. But hardware is only half the story. The other half is how it's used. The Soviets don't use the P-39 the way the Americans tried to. They don't send it up to intercept high-altitude bomber formations. They don't primarily use it for high-altitude combat air patrol. Instead, they use it for what it does best. Soviet doctrine by 1942 to 43 emphasizes several principles: concentration of force, aggressive tactics, and adapting to available resources. The P-39 fits well into this evolving approach. Soviet fighter units typically operate in pairs and flights, coordinating their attacks. They don't rely on individual heroics. They work together. And they fight low. Most Soviet fighter operations are conducted at medium to low altitudes, between 1,000 and 5,000 meters, often lower during ground attack missions, sometimes just above treetop level. Why? Because that's where much of the Eastern Front air war takes place. German fighters in 1942 and 1943 are excellent aircraft. The Bf-109G, the FW-190, they're powerful, well-armed, and fast, especially at altitude. But at low altitude, some of their advantages diminish. And the Germans, despite their skill, are increasingly outnumbered and fighting defensively by mid-1943. Soviet P-39 pilots learn to exploit the tactical situation. They attack German aircraft during vulnerable phases, takeoff, landing, ground attack runs when the enemy is focused on targets below. They conduct fighter sweeps at altitudes where the P-39 performs well. And when they engage in air combat, they fight intelligently. A skilled Soviet P-39 pilot doesn't try to outclimb a Bf-109 at altitude. That's playing to the enemy's strengths. Instead, he keeps the fight at low to medium altitude, where his aircraft performs well. He uses the Airacobra's good roll rate and reasonable turning ability. The 109 is faster in some regimes, but at low altitude, in maneuvering combat, the fight is more even. And if engagement isn't favorable, the P-39's speed at low altitude allows disengagement options. The 37mm cannon is the equalizer. You don't need a prolonged dogfight. You need one good burst at close range. Soviet pilots are trained to conserve ammunition, close the range, fire accurately, make the limited ammunition count. This approach proves effective. By mid-1943, Soviet P-39 units are achieving notable success in combat, and the Luftwaffe begins to take notice. If the P-39 was the weapon, the Soviet aces were the hands that wielded it, and the greatest of them all was Aleksandr Pokryshkin. Pokryshkin comes from a working-class background, the son of a factory worker in Novonikolayevsk, later Novosibirsk. In the 1930s, he works as an aviation mechanic. He studies aerodynamics independently, reading technical manuals. He persistently requests transfer to pilot training. When the war starts, he's flying MiG-3 fighters. His early combat experience is difficult. The MiG-3 is challenging to fly, and he's still learning. But he's analytical. He observes. He begins documenting tactics, studying what works and what doesn't. In late 1942 and early 1943, his unit transitions to the P-39, and Pokryshkin's effectiveness increases dramatically. Pokryshkin doesn't just fly the Airacobra. He systematically develops tactics optimized for its characteristics. He emphasizes energy tactics, using speed and altitude advantage, coordinated attacks with wingmen, discipline in ammunition conservation, the importance of situational awareness. He works to improve Soviet fighter doctrine, writing reports and training materials based on combat experience. By the end of the war, Aleksandr Pokryshkin is officially credited with 59 aerial victories. Though like all World War II kill totals, the actual number is debated by historians. He's 3 times Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor. He's one of the most successful Allied fighter pilots of the war. And the vast majority of his combat flying was done in the P-39. He's not alone. Grigory Rechkalov, officially 56 victories, mostly in P-39s. Nikolai Gulayev, officially 57 victories, many in P-39s. Alexander Klubov, officially 50 victories, primarily in P-39s. These are among the top Soviet aces of the war. All flew Airacobras extensively. In total, Soviet records claim several thousand aerial victories by P-39 pilots during the war. While these numbers are certainly affected by overclaiming, a problem for all air forces in World War II, the P-39 was clearly an effective platform in Soviet service. But here's what makes the story remarkable. These men aren't fighting against novices. They're fighting the Luftwaffe. Let's be clear about who the Soviets are facing. The Luftwaffe in 1942 and 1943 is highly experienced and skilled. German pilots like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, Günther Rall. These men accumulate extraordinary victory totals. They've been flying combat missions since the war began. Poland, France, the Battle of Britain in some cases, North Africa. They're professionals. Many are multiple aces, and their initial assessment of the P-39 is dismissive. There are Luftwaffe reports and some memoir accounts where German pilots describe encounters with P-39s in various theatres. Some consider them easier opponents than other Allied types, particularly at altitude. The reputation follows the aircraft. But on the Eastern Front, German pilots find Soviet P-39 units increasingly formidable. By 1943, the Eastern Front has become extremely costly for the Luftwaffe. German pilots are flying multiple missions daily. They're outnumbered. Aircraft and pilots are wearing out. Replacement aircraft and trained pilots become harder to replace. And Soviet aviation is improving. Better training, better tactics, better coordination, and aircraft like the P-39 that are well suited to the combat environment. German pilots begin reporting that Soviet P-39 units are dangerous opponents, particularly at low to medium altitudes. The combination of the 37mm cannon, good performance at lower altitudes, and increasingly skilled Soviet pilots creates a credible threat. The Airacobra earns respect, not through any single dramatic incident, but through accumulated combat effectiveness over thousands of engagements. If you want to see the P-39 in major operations, look at the Battle of the Kuban, April to September 1943. The Kuban bridgehead on the northern coast of the Black Sea. The Germans hold defensive positions. The Soviets are applying pressure. And the sky above the Kuban becomes heavily contested airspace. Both sides commit substantial air assets. Hundreds of aircraft on both sides. Thousands of sorties. The Luftwaffe deploys Bf-109Gs, Fw-190s, Ju-87 Stukas, and various bomber types. Experienced units, well-trained pilots. The Soviets field P-39s, Yak fighters, La-5s, and Il-2 Sturmoviks. And for the first time in the Eastern Front Air War, the Soviets are achieving rough parity, in some engagements, local superiority. The air battles are intense, combat at various altitudes, often at low level, high loss rates on both sides. Pokryshkin is there, flying with the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. So is Rechkalov. Other top Soviet pilots participate. The P-39 units are heavily engaged throughout the campaign. Soviet combat reports from the Kuban period show P-39 units claiming significant victory totals. While we must account for overclaiming, it's clear that Soviet fighters, including P-39 units, were effective during this campaign. By the end of the Kuban campaign, the Soviets have demonstrated they can contest German air superiority. German ground forces find Soviet ground attack aircraft increasingly problematic. The Luftwaffe remains formidable, but the balance is shifting. And the P-39 has proven itself as a viable combat aircraft in the Eastern Front environment. Let's examine the specific technical factors that made the P-39 work in Soviet service. It's not just about tactics or combat environment. First, maintenance and logistics. Soviet ground crews work under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Sub-zero temperatures, mud, limited facilities, often close to combat zones. But they're resourceful and capable. They work with what they have. The Allison V-1710 engine proves reliable in Soviet service. It's relatively simple compared to some power plants. It doesn't require 100-octane fuel. The Soviets operate it successfully on their available fuel grades, typically 93 octane. It's tolerant of field conditions. When the engine needs work, Soviet mechanics can perform necessary maintenance with available tools and parts. Compare this to some Soviet engines, which have higher maintenance demands and parts supply issues. The P-39 proves to be a practical, maintainable aircraft. Second, Soviet modifications. The Soviets don't simply accept the P-39 as delivered, they adapt it. Soviet units often remove equipment they consider unnecessary. Some radio equipment that doesn't integrate with Soviet systems. Sometimes wing machine guns to save weight and simplify maintenance. Weight reduction improves performance, particularly at the low altitudes where they operate. They install Soviet gun sights and instruments where practical. These modifications are practical adaptations to their operational environment. Third, operational approach. The Soviets operate their P-39s at altitudes where the aircraft performs well. They don't try to use it as a high-altitude interceptor. Most combat occurs between 1,000 and 5,000 meters, where the P-39's engine develops good power and the aircraft handles well. This matches the P-39's strengths to the mission requirements. Fourth, the armament. That 37mm cannon. Western air forces often view its slow rate of fire, roughly 140 rounds per minute, as a significant limitation. Soviet pilots adapt to it. They're trained on cannon-armed fighters. Soviet doctrine emphasizes accurate gunnery, closing to effective range before firing. Soviet armorers maintain the cannon carefully. They work to maximize reliability. The result? The 37mm proves effective in Soviet service. Against aircraft, especially bombers and ground attack types, it's devastating. Against ground targets, trucks, light armor, structures, it's highly effective. These aren't revolutionary changes, they're practical adaptations. matching the aircraft to the mission to the tactical environment, the tactics to what works. It's effective. Let's talk about what the P-39 meant to the Soviet pilots who flew it. Because in 1942, when the first Airacobras arrive, the VVS is rebuilding from catastrophic losses. Pilots are often hastily trained. They're outnumbered. The Luftwaffe has been dominant. And then comes this American fighter. It's fast, it's sturdy, it has a powerful cannon, and it gives them a chance. Soviet pilots develop genuine affection for the P-39. Unlike some other Lend-Lease aircraft which are tolerated or disliked, the Airacobra is genuinely popular with many units. Pilots paint kills on the fuselage, personal insignia, slogans, names. They personalize their aircraft, give them identities. Pokryshkin's aircraft, with various tactical numbers during the war, becomes well known. His white number aircraft become recognized by friend and foe. There are numerous accounts from Soviet P-39 pilots about their experiences with the aircraft. Many express appreciation for its characteristics, its handling, its protection, its firepower. After years of flying fighters that were often outclassed, the P-39 represents a capable, competitive weapon. This psychological factor, confidence in one's equipment, matters in combat. Pilots who believe their aircraft can compete fly more aggressively, more effectively. The P-39 provides that confidence. By 1944, the VVS isn't just surviving, it's winning. Let's move forward. The strategic situation has transformed. The Germans are retreating. The Red Army is advancing westward, and the VVS is dominating Soviet airspace. Soviet P-39 regiments are now elite units. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 9th Guards, the 100th Guards. They're equipped with experienced pilots and well-maintained aircraft. And they're effective. The Germans are flying defensive missions, trying to slow the Soviet advance, trying to protect retreating forces. But Soviet fighters are omnipresent. P-39s, Yaks, Lavochkins, hunting German aircraft, attacking ground targets, establishing air superiority. There are Luftwaffe reports from 1944 describing the difficult air situation on the Eastern Front. German pilots are outnumbered, outflown in many engagements, and losing aircraft and pilots at unsustainable rates. This is the new reality. The Luftwaffe, severely depleted by years of attrition on multiple fronts, is being overwhelmed on the Eastern Front. Pilot quality is declining as experienced aviators are killed and replaced by hastily trained newcomers. Fuel is increasingly scarce. Aircraft are worn and hard to replace. And the Soviets have achieved air superiority across most of the front. By late 1944, Soviet P-39 units operate deep into Eastern Europe, escorting Il-2 Sturmovix, conducting fighter sweeps, attacking German airfields. Pokryshkin is promoted through the ranks. He's a 3-time hero of the Soviet Union. He's involved in training and doctrine development. The P-39 Airacobra, the fighter that was rejected by other air forces, has become one of the most successful Allied fighters on the Eastern Front. And the Germans have learned to respect it. But we must be clear about the price. Because the success of the P-39 on the Eastern Front came at enormous human cost. Thousands of Soviet pilots died flying Airacobras. The aircraft was tough and protective compared to many Soviet types. But no aircraft is invincible. A well-placed burst from German cannon would bring down a P-39 as surely as any other fighter. And Soviet tactics, aggressive, often at low altitude, high operational tempo, meant casualties were constant. The VVS kept different records than Western air forces. Complete loss figures are difficult to establish, but the cost in lives was severe. Of the approximately 4,750 P-39s sent to the Soviet Union, a large percentage were lost to combat, accidents, and operational wear. Perhaps only a few hundred survived the war intact. And the men who flew them? The average age of Soviet fighter pilots was young, early 20s. Many died before age 25. There are memorials throughout the former Soviet Union to VVS personnel, stone monuments, lists of names, mass graves. They commemorate pilots who died in combat, many of them flying P-39s. The average age on these memorials is heartbreaking. War is not a simple story. It's not clean heroics. It's young men in freezing cockpits, flying multiple missions daily, knowing each sortie might be their last. The P-39 gave them a weapon they could fight with, a tool they trusted, but it couldn't give them safety. No aircraft could. The victory was won with blood. Over the decades, various myths have grown around the P-39's Eastern Front service. Let's separate fact from fiction. Myth 1. The P-39 only succeeded because Soviet pilots were reckless. This appears in some German accounts and was repeated by historians who didn't examine Soviet tactics carefully. The idea? Soviet success with the P-39 came from willingness to accept massive casualties and fly suicidal missions. It's misleading. Soviet tactics did emphasize aggression. Casualties were higher than Western air forces would have accepted. This is true. But Soviet P-39 pilots weren't reckless. Pokryshkin was a careful tactician who studied energy management, gunnery, and formation tactics. He wrote training materials that emphasized survival and effectiveness. Soviet success came from matching the aircraft to appropriate missions and developing effective tactics, not from recklessness. Myth 2. The P-39 only worked because it faced inferior opposition. Also incorrect. The Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front was formidable throughout the war. The Bf-109G and Fw-190 were excellent fighters, competitive with or superior to most Allied types in various performance categories. The P-39 succeeded not because German aircraft were weak, but because it was used at altitudes where it performed well. Soviet pilots developed tactics that played to its strengths. It was well suited to the Eastern Front combat environment. At 3,000 meters altitude, a P-39Q versus a Bf-109 G6. What speed? Roughly comparable at this altitude, slight edge varies by specific variant and configuration. Climb rate, 109 G generally superior. Maneuverability, roughly comparable at this altitude with different characteristics. Firepower, P-39s, 37mm cannon delivers heavier punch per hit. 109's armament has higher rate of fire. Protection, P-39 generally has better pilot protection and survivability features. Visibility, P-39 generally superior due to canopy design. Neither aircraft has overwhelming superiority at low altitude. Success depends on tactics, pilot skill, and circumstances. Myth. 3. Lend-Lease didn't matter. The Soviets would have won anyway. This is Cold War-era Soviet propaganda, sometimes echoed today. The historical record is clear. Lend-Lease made a crucial difference. Not just aircraft, but trucks, fuel, food, raw materials, and equipment. Could the Soviets have eventually prevailed without Lend-Lease? Perhaps, but at vastly greater cost in lives and time. The 4,750 P-39s provided the VVS with a capable fighter at a critical period when Soviet production was disrupted and losses were severe. It wasn't the only factor in Soviet victory, but it mattered. By 1945, the war in Europe is ending. Soviet forces are in Germany. Berlin is besieged. The Luftwaffe is finished, scattered remnants flying desperate missions. And the P-39 is being phased out. The VVS is transitioning to newer aircraft. Yak-3s and improved Yak-9s. La-7Zs. These newer Soviet designs have incorporated lessons learned during the war. The P-39, reliable as it is showing its age. Airframes are stressed from years of intensive combat use. Engines are tired. Spare parts are increasingly scarce as American production has shifted to other types. By May 1945, most frontline P-39 units have transitioned to newer aircraft. The Airacobras are reassigned to reserve squadrons, training units, and second-line defense roles. Some are simply retired, parked at airfields, awaiting disposition. After the war, the remaining P-39s are quickly phased out of Soviet service. By the late 1940s, very few remain operational. Most are scrapped. Some are used as training airframes. A handful are preserved for museums. The fighters that helped win the Eastern Front Air War are gone, but the men who flew them remember. Decades after the war, Soviet, later Russian, veterans gather to remember their service. Many of them flew P-39s. In various interviews and memoirs published after the Cold War ended, former P-39 pilots spoke about their aircraft. Grigory Rechkalov, interviewed in the 1990s before his death, spoke positively about the Airacobra, its reliability, its firepower, its handling characteristics at low altitude. Other veterans echoed similar sentiments. The P-39 was well regarded by many who flew it. Common themes emerge from these accounts. The aircraft was sturdy and could absorb damage. The 37mm cannon was highly effective when it hit. The visibility was excellent compared to many Soviet types. The handling was good and predictable. The cockpit was comfortable, better heated than many Soviet fighters, important in Russian winters. These weren't propaganda talking points. These were old men remembering the machines they'd trusted with their lives 60 years earlier. One veteran, whose name is recorded in a Russian aviation history archive, stated simply, "The Airacobra was honest. It did what you asked it to do. In combat, that's everything." These men, these boys really, when they first climbed into P-39 cockpits, carried the burden of defending their homeland through the most devastating conflict in human history. And they did it, in part, in an aircraft their allies had discarded. Let's look at what we can verify. Here are the documented facts. Approximately 4,750 P-39 Airacobras delivered to the Soviet Union via Lend-Lease. tens of thousands of combat sorties flown by Soviet P-39 units between 1942 and 1945. Multiple Soviet aces achieved their victories primarily in P-39s, including several of the highest-scoring Soviet pilots of the war. Documented combat effectiveness in multiple major campaigns, Kuban, Kursk, the advance through Eastern Europe. Soviet claims for P-39 victories total several thousand aircraft. While we must account for the overclaiming that affected all air forces, Soviet, German, American, British, the pattern is clear. P-39 units were effective in combat. But here's the number that matters most in terms of understanding the aircraft's reception. Soviet pilots requested assignment to P-39 units. They didn't avoid them. They didn't complain about being forced to fly a death trap. Compare that to some other Lend-Lease types. The P-40 was accepted, but not preferred. The P-47, when it arrived late in the war, was considered too large and complex for Soviet needs. But the P-39... Units wanted to keep them even when newer Soviet fighters became available. That tells you everything you need to know. Was the P-39 Airacobra a great aircraft? By the standards of high-altitude strategic air warfare, no. It lacked the performance ceiling for that mission. By the standards of the Eastern Front, low-altitude combat, ground attack, close air support, it was effective. Well suited to the mission. Matched to the environment. The P-39 didn't fail. It was simply mismatched to the mission in American and British service. In Soviet service, where the mission matched its capabilities, it succeeded. We need to return to something fundamental: the cost. Because it's easy to discuss tactics and victory claims and forget what war actually means. Every P-39 shot down represented a life, usually a young life ending, often violently, often alone, often in pain and fear. Aircraft are rebuilt. People aren't. Throughout Russia and the former Soviet Union, there are memorials to VVS personnel. Simple monuments, often erected by communities remembering local men who didn't return. Lists of names, ages, ranks. Many of these men flew P-39s. The ages are what strike you. 22, 23, 19, 24. We don't know all their stories. Soviet record-keeping during wartime was incomplete. Many individual stories are lost. But we know the outlines. Young men, often from rural areas or working-class backgrounds. Trained hastily in wartime programs. Sent to combat units. Given aircraft and a mission. Some survived. Many didn't. They weren't superhuman heroes. They were people, frightened, determined, doing an impossible job because someone had to. The P-39 gave them a tool they could use, a weapon they could fight with, a machine that gave them a chance. But it couldn't protect them from the fundamental horror of aerial combat. We remember the machine, but we must remember them. What did the P-39 service in Soviet hands teach aircraft designers? Several lessons emerged, though they weren't always learned immediately. First, mission-specific design matters more than general excellence. The P-39 wasn't the best fighter by any universal metric. But for low-altitude operations, it was competitive and effective. This reinforced what some designers already knew. aircraft must be matched to their intended mission. An interceptor, a ground attack fighter, and a high-altitude escort are different problems requiring different solutions. Second, survivability features matter. The P-39's armor protection, self-sealing tanks, and robust structure contributed to its success in Soviet service. Pilots who might have died in less protected aircraft survived to fight again. Post-war fighter design increasingly emphasized pilot protection and aircraft survivability. Third, concentrated firepower is effective. The nose-mounted 37mm cannon, despite its slow rate of fire, proved devastating in skilled hands. The concentration of firepower on the aircraft centerline, cannon and machine guns all firing through the propeller arc, meant no convergence issues. This influenced some post-war designs that emphasize centerline armament. Fourth, ease of maintenance in field conditions is crucial. The P-39's relative simplicity and maintainability in harsh field conditions contributed to its operational success. Soviet ground crews could keep them flying under conditions that would have grounded more complex aircraft. This lesson was sometimes learned, sometimes forgotten in post-war design. The P-39 itself didn't spawn direct descendants. The follow-on P-63 King Cobra, while similar in layout, served primarily with the Soviets and saw limited combat. But the lessons from its service, about matching aircraft to mission, about the importance of survivability, about operational suitability, influenced Cold War fighter development. Today, in 2025, only a handful of P-39 Airacobras still exist worldwide, perhaps a dozen in museums, a very small number in private collections, only 2 or 3 airworthy examples. They're rare, historical artifacts, precious survivors of a massive production run that once numbered over 10,000 aircraft. When an airworthy P-39 appears at an airshow, most spectators don't recognize it. It doesn't have the fame of a Mustang or Spitfire or Corsair, the glamorous fighters everyone knows. It looks different. The tricycle landing gear, the car door entry, the odd proportions with no engine in the nose. It doesn't fit the mental image of a World War II fighter. But then, it flies. And if you know the history, if you understand what this aircraft accomplished, you see it differently. You see it through Soviet eyes, through the eyes of pilots who flew it over the Kuban, over Kursk, over Poland, and into Germany. You see the machines that helped turn the tide of the Eastern Front Air War. Aviation historians have worked for decades to document the P-39's Soviet service. Books have been written, many in Russian, combat records analyzed, veterans interviewed before they passed away. Slowly, the story has emerged. The narrative has shifted from failed American fighter to highly effective, inappropriate role. Modern analysis of the P-39's design shows it was actually quite sophisticated for its era. The mid-engine layout, while unconventional, created genuine advantages in weight distribution and allowed the powerful centerline armament. The problem wasn't the design. It was the removal of the turbo supercharger and the attempt to use the aircraft in roles it wasn't optimized for. In the role it was suited for, low-altitude combat and ground attack, it was a solid, effective design. Context matters, mission matters, doctrine matters. The same hardware used differently produces different results. So what is the legacy of the P-39 Airacobra? In the West, It remains a footnote, a curiosity, an example of how not to modify a promising design. Most aviation enthusiasts can't name a single P-39 pilot, can't describe its combat record, know it only as that weird fighter with the engine in the back that nobody liked. But in Russia, it's different. Visit the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. There's a P-39 on display, carefully preserved. Aleksandr Pokryshkin's aircraft from the war, or a representative example marked in his honor. Russian aviation historians regard the P-39 as one of the most important Lend-Lease contributions, a fighter that arrived at a critical moment and served effectively throughout the war. The names of P-39 aces, Pokryshkin, Rechkolov, Gulayev, are known, respected, remembered. The P-39 story teaches us several things. First, context shapes effectiveness. The same weapon that fails in one war can succeed in another. Not because the weapon changes, but because the war is different. The Americans and British tried to use the P-39 as a high-altitude interceptor and escort. It struggled. The Soviets used it as a low-altitude fighter and ground attack aircraft. It excelled. Same aircraft, different war, different result. Second, doctrine and tactics matter as much as hardware. The P-39 in inexperienced hands, using poor tactics, would have been ineffective, regardless of altitude. But in skilled hands, using tactics optimized for its characteristics, it became lethal. Pokryshkin and pilots like him didn't just fly the P-39. They developed an entire tactical system around it. Energy tactics, coordinated attacks, disciplined gunnery. The weapon is only as good as the system that employs it. Third, success is measured in outcomes, not specifications. On paper, the P-39 had serious limitations: poor high-altitude performance, slow-firing main armament, unconventional design. But it achieved its mission. Soviet P-39 units helped establish air superiority over critical battlefields. They protected ground forces. They destroyed enemy aircraft and ground targets. That's success, regardless of what the specification sheet says. And finally, remember the people, not just the machines. The P-39 Airacobra didn't win battles. Pilots did. Young men, teenagers, really, many of them, who climbed into cockpits day after day, knowing they might not return. They fought with skill, courage, and determination. They adapted tactics. They maintained their aircraft under impossible conditions. They flew when they were exhausted, when they were wounded, when they'd seen friends die. And many of them died doing it. The P-39 gave them a tool, a weapon, a chance. But the victory was theirs. In 2010, a monument was unveiled in Krasnodar, Russia. It depicts Aleksandr Pokryshkin standing beside a P-39 Airacobra. The inscription is simple: to the pilots who defended the motherland. No mention of kill counts, no technical specifications, no tactical analysis, just memory. The German aces initially dismissed the P-39 Airacobra, called it unsuitable, called it ineffective, until Soviet pilots proved otherwise, at low altitude, where the Eastern Front air war was actually fought. They took a rejected weapon and made it formidable. They adapted it, mastered it, used it to help win the most costly war in human history. It's a story of adaptation, of determination, of finding ways to win with what you have, not what you wish you had. The P-39 Airacobra wasn't the best fighter of World War II, but in the hands of skilled, courageous pilots, fighting the war they actually faced rather than the one others imagined, it was good enough. And sometimes good enough is all you need.